If there's a silver lining, and I'm not sure there is one, but if there is one to these challenging days, it is that what it means to be a Christian has rarely been so clear. To do justice and love kindness and walk humbly with God, to love others as Christ loved us, to show compassion to the most vulnerable. That is the drumbeat of Scripture and the life to which we are called. I'm grateful to each of you for leaning into that calling by your presence here as we seek to learn and grow and act in compassion. I want to thank Chris Burton, the director of the Leadership Institute, and also Professor Safwat Marzouk for their conceiving and planning of this conference, and also to our chaplain, Mari Rennick, for planning the worship, and also to Deborah Keyes and Katie Heichman for their tireless efforts to make sure that all the details are attended to. At Union Presbyterian Seminary, our mission is to prepare people to be leaders of gospel-inspired transformative change in pursuit of a more just and compassionate world. Hosting this kind of critical conversation about what it means to be a Christian in these days is one of the ways that we fulfill that mission. So welcome. I know you are in for a feast.
Good afternoon. My name is Wojciech Szczerba. I come from Poland, and I'm supposed to share some reflection on neighbors and migrants. And it's my pleasure. And I would like to refer to the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And I know it's tricky, and I know it's risky. We hate wars. We don't like to think about people killing each other and destroyed countries, but it's still going on. And once you had this type of experience, it's with you, and it's with me. It's somehow growing with me. So I remember very well February 24, 2022. I was actually here in the States, in Raleigh at that time. I had few friends in Ukraine. They told me that before coming that, well, something might be coming, but nobody believed them really. So we thought it was a gossip. But then I woke up in February 24, and I found like tons of emails from my Ukrainian friends, from my Polish friends, from my family. And nobody knew what was going on. I mean, they were angry and they were feared, lots of questions. They were talking about Russia's aggression and also about Ukrainian refugees coming to Poland. But then, you know, when you receive emails and you read emails, you can have some idea. You understand that, but you don't have the feeling. So then, of the situation. So then I went back home a few days later, and I went to our railway station, our streets and downtown, and I was overwhelmed. I have never seen anything like this. The whole city was full of migrants or refugees. Day by day, every day, really, trains would bring 10,000 Ukrainian refugees to our country. So by April, there was something like 4 million Ukrainians, and nobody knew in my country, nobody knew what to do at that point. But then a miracle happened without any coordination, without any sign from anybody. You know, just Poles, hundreds and thousands of Poles, they took their cars, and trains and buses. They went to the eastern part of Poland and to the railway stations, and they invited Ukrainians to their houses and their apartments. And there were no refugee camps, no detained centers, no ghettos, nothing like this. Simply the doors were open and those people were invited to apartments and houses. I have never seen anything like this. And well, those individual people, citizens, they were followed by organizations, by institutions, by some churches, not all churches, and by our government. So within a few weeks, Ukrainians were granted full access to Polish labor market. They could work, to our schools, so children could learn, healthcare system, public transportations, everything. They became a part of our life. So even now, 2025, about 1 million Ukrainians still live in Poland, and they are part of our life and part of our society. And I think it was really an amazing experience for many of us. And I think that it was something more than just mass relief action. I think it was some kind of existential gesture of one society just caring for another human being or another society with their questions and fears and pains, suffering, and hope to find a safe place in another country. And it worked. At that time, at this very moment, hospitality, just like in Jacques Derrida ideas, meant opening doors and no questions asked, no negotiations, no expectation, just whoever wants may come, is invited. Just pure hospitality. And it's not an apotheosis of Polish society. We have lots of problems. We are a complicated society, but at that time, it really worked out for some reasons. And not only in Poland, in other neighboring countries too, in Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, Moldova, and Baltic countries. It worked out. And I think this was some kind of example that we can think of relationships, of relation with the other people, not in terms of transaction, not in terms of gains or some kind of interests, but just thinking of caring for another person because he or she is a human being, and that's it. And I think this is what Emmanuel Levinas says, that we see ourselves in the face of another person, especially the one who is sick, who is excluded, who is depreciated, or Martin Buber, when he says that we grow as human beings in relationship, I, thou, and we cannot treat the other person as a thing, it, because then we not only objectify the other person, but we also somehow kill ourselves. Or maybe Jacques Derrida, again, just open the door. However practically looks like, just open the door. So this was this moment. Well, was it ideal? No. In the same time, in between Poland and Belarus, there is a wall being built, and no refugees from the Middle East are welcome. Zero. So this paradox, how to find it? So who's the neighbor? Well, I would like to refer to the line of Bonhoeffer, who was born in my town, when he says, well, when you meet, in my paraphrase, when he meet another person, always see Christ in this person, no matter who they are. If you meet another person, always like Christ toward this person, no matter who they might be. But it's not easy. So just finishing this reflection, I would like to refer to a poem by one of my favorite, actually, Polish poets, Wisława Szymborska. She got her Nobel Prize in '96, but this poem she wrote just after the war in 1945. Still, that's the title. And she writes, in sealed box cars travel names across the land, and how far they will travel so, and will they ever get out? Don't ask. I won't say. I don't know. The name Nathan strikes fist against wall. The name Isaac, demented, sinks. The name Sarah calls out for water for the name Aaron, that's dying of thirst. Don't jump while it's moving, name David. You're a name that dooms to defeat. A small rain, one tear, a dry season. Trucks lead off into black forest. Correct, clicks the wheel, gladeless forest. Correct, through the forest, a convoy of clamors. Correct. Awakened in the night, I hear correct, crash of silence on silence. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this encouraging and promising story, and for the poem as well. My name is Safwat Marzouk, and I teach Old Testament here at Union Presbyterian Seminary. So I want to welcome all of you, whether you are in person or online right now, or you will watch later on the YouTube channel of UPSEM. Before I introduce our speaker for the lecture this evening, I want to acknowledge that as we think about the notion of migration on this land, that we are welcoming others on a land that is not ours. So we acknowledge the Native American tribes that lived on these lands and were forced to migrate because of colonialism and imperialism. Not everyone in America chose to migrate. There were many ancestral communities that were kidnapped and were forced into enslavement and brought into this continent, and that we also acknowledge. Compassion Across Borders, a call for solidarity and justice. What is another conference in the midst of all these deportations and dehumanization of migrants in our context? We're doing this conference so that we hold still. Because one of the ways dictatorship succeeds is making people feel that they are hopeless. So we are here and across the live stream to build a community, to hold solidarity with the most vulnerable in our midst. It is an honor and a privilege to welcome our first speaker for this conference, Reverend Isaac Villegas. It is wonderful to have you here. We've known each other virtually for a long time, and today we met for the first time in person. Isaac is a pastor and a writer from Durham, North Carolina, where he is also now doing his PhD in theology and religious studies at Duke. And he was raised along the US-Mexico border by immigrant parents, so his story of migration resonates with the work that he will lead us through. He pastored Chapel Hill Mennonite Fellowship for 16 years and served on the Mennonite Church USA Executive Board between 2013 to 2015. He recently finished serving on the North Carolina Council of Churches board and currently contributes to publications like The Christian Century and Sojourners. An award-winning writer, photographer, he has received research grants from the Louisville Institute focused on unity and remembrance in the borderlands. And he has published works on ecclesial ethics and wounded life. His most recent work is a wonderful book titled A Migrant God, a Christian Vision for Immigrant Justice. Please join me in welcoming Isaac in our midst this evening. Thank you, Isaac.
Professor Marzouk, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Grateful to be here with all of you. Yes, this is quite an honor. I'm going to share with you some stories and some Bible passages. So I'm going to start with stories from my pastoral ministry, things I've seen along the way. I'm going to show you some pictures I've taken, some pictures some others have taken. And I thought I'd start with these stories because, as Professor Marzouk has already said, I feel hopeless. Maybe some of you do too, despair at the conditions of our world. And for me, these are stories that I run through my mind, these faces, these people, when I feel despair, to try to figure out some kind of hope to continue on in the struggle. So that's why I start with these stories, to provoke our imagination, to think of what might be possible in this world. Obviously, we can't just do the same thing over and over, but once we see what other people are doing, maybe that might inspire us to do something new. So start with some stories, and then just a little dip into the Bible at the end to talk about how these stories are important to our faith, that these stories are already there in these biblical passages. So that's what we'll do here. First set of stories is about sanctuary efforts. So these are communities, religious communities that have protected people from deportation here in the United States. This is from the first Trump administration. During President Trump's first term in office, our church in Chapel Hill protected Rosa del Carmen from ICE's plans, promise, threat to deport her. So we offered her protective sanctuary on church property. Our church rented space, our Mennonite church rented space from a Presbyterian congregation. So we formed a covenant together on how to welcome Rosa and care for her as our two churches. And this is from the press conference where we welcomed her. So the government flagged her for deportation, even though her immigration case was pending in the courts. Typically, like during Obama's administration, if you had an immigration case in the courts, the Department of Homeland Security wouldn't interfere with that and let the courts run its course. Trump ended all of that and would flag people for deportation even though they had a court date, next month. So we remodeled a church office into her bedroom, into Rosa's bedroom, and she lived there on church property for 2 years, which involved reorganizing our church's life in terms of hospitality to care for her, to provide for her. So this is like she depended on us for everything, for everyday necessities. So we had to do grocery runs, let's say, her errands, all of that. We also provided, that's me with a beard. I took off the beard some people don't recognize. Basically during the pandemic, wearing those masks and the beard, it just got annoying, and it hasn't gone back. My wife says my face looks better without the beard, so here we are. So part of offering Rosa a protective sanctuary was to do around-the-clock accompaniment. So we trained people in civil disobedience, what a proper judicial warrant looked like if someone would show up. And we were there, we planned overnight shifts, just in case ICE agents showed up. And through this work with Rosa, we became part of the national sanctuary movement to defend undocumented residents from our community from deportation. In 2018, our coalition of churches in North Carolina had 6 people in church protective sanctuary, which was the most of any state. All of this ended in good news for Rosa. Rosa finally left the protection of our church in the spring of 2020. The courts finally granted her a stay of deportation, which would not have been granted to her if she was actually deported. And this is her receiving the news on my phone on speaker from her attorney. So after this, she was able to return to her life in North Carolina, where she works, and she has 3 children who are U.S. citizens. That's not how things went for another person in sanctuary in our community in Durham, whose name was Samuel Oliver Bruno. He had been living in sanctuary in a Methodist church just down the road from where I live. During those same years, he was part of the sanctuary community that we cultivated. This is Samuel with his son, Daniel. So last time I saw him, Samuel, was inside Wake County Jail in Raleigh. He was in the cell across from mine. Plainclothes officers had tackled him to the ground, and they took him by surprise there as he was waiting in the waiting room at the USCIS office, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services office. He'd been summoned there for an appointment related to his application for humanitarian parole. His wife was ill, and he requested to remain in the States to care for her. When they arrested him, so we actually have no idea why the Trump administration targeted him for deportation. He had a work permit, and they just rescinded his work permit. and ordered him to self-deport. Self-deport is basically you buy an airplane ticket with your own money and you just leave the country. And he decided he wouldn't do that, he wouldn't leave behind his responsibilities here in the United States with his family, with his job, and try to remake himself in Mexico, where he had left long before. He was born there, but hadn't lived there for decades. So instead of abandoning all of that here in North Carolina, he entered into the protective care of a Methodist congregation. And he lived there at the church, trying over and over again to convince the government, doing things the right way, to convince the government to reinstate his documentation status. And the government said, yes, we will work with you. Come show up to the office and we will process your paperwork. And that's not what ended up happening. Instead, they sent ICE agents, unidentified ICE agents, and took him back into that ICE van. People from his church, the Methodist Church, along with members from our extended sanctuary community, were summoned via text, phone calls. Some were already there accompanying him to the appointment, and they dashed around the back of the building to try to block the van. They crowded around there while agents forced him inside the van. So these are friends who were there blocking the van. So by the time that I arrived, there were 100 people in the parking lot blocking the van, and I made my way to the crowd of friends that were gathered arm to arm around the van to protect Samuel from the van from leaving. So we surrounded. This is one of the other people who formed that human chain, facing off with the ICE director. He's the field agent for the Carolinas who came for this abduction. And that's just such a picture of courage and bravery to me. That's Ernesto, a fellow pastor. So through those tinted windows of the van, I could see Samuel in handcuffs in the back of the van, in the back seat. We were all in our human chain, encircling the vehicle, trying to keep him with us. There's 27 of us there. So we remained there at the van side by side until the police officers pulled our arms apart and handcuffed us and arrested us. And they transported us to the local jail, the same one where Samuel would be incarcerated until they would ship him down to Stewart's Detention Center in Georgia and then to the border, Mexico. Inside the jail, as officers had processed and escorted us to our holding cells, we saw Samuel across the corridor, and he saw us. And I still remember him just lifting his hand to his heart and bowing his head towards us. And then the officers took him away and deported him, or escorted him deeper into the recesses of the facility, never for us to see him again. This is there outside of the jail. That's Daniel, his son. It was a prayer service that we ended up having. This is Reverend Barber here, not familiar to you. He showed up for the vigil, for the prayer. My professor, Richard Hayes, there in the back, New Testament professor at Duke. He was at the church where Samuel was living in sanctuary. So within days of his arrest, he was deported and then released to Matamoros, Mexico, and then the border with Brownsville, Texas. And then in 2021, still separated from his wife and son in North Carolina, Samuel died in a car accident while going to work. And that's Samuel with his wife, Julia. Part of why I show you these pictures is Rosa, who was at our church, is such a success story, and that gives me hope. And I want to share that with you all. But also to recognize not everyone makes it. And these are the faces that are lodged in my mind, so I'm sharing them with all of you. So the architects of this U.S. war against migration, they've built a deadly environment in the borderlands. According to the 1994 National Strategy Report of the U.S. Border Patrol, they outlined a plan to redirect migrants to the most dangerous regions of the desert. They called this a shift and flow, is what they said in the document, in order to force people into more hostile terrain. I should just say, this is down by Douglas, Arizona, and this is the wall going in one direction towards Douglas. So this is, again, redirecting the flow. They militarize, they create the most barriers around the easiest places to cross, which are by cities. And then they leave, and then if you drive, 5 miles away from Douglas, or maybe it was more than that, I can't remember, it just looks like that. I mean, it's more dangerous to cross there. The shift and flow is to more hostile terrain where you might end up dying of hypothermia because you're not by any other community. So the strategy is called prevention through deterrence. And since 1998, over 800 human remains have been found in the desert. 8,000 human remains have been found in the desert. It's always hard to calculate how many people have died. You could just track remains. Sometimes you can't find remains. The coroner's office in Arizona has a partnership with the University of Arizona, and they maintain an online database to keep track of people who've died while crossing the border. So this is where somebody has died, and someone sets out a cross in the spot according to the GPS coordinates that the University of Arizona maintains. So here you can see a picture of the map that they keep with whatever kind of documentation they can find for the remains that they have found. So each dot is where someone's remains were found. And what they find sometimes is a decomposed corpse, sometimes only like a skeletal fragment of a human being. They post all the information they can figure out for each of those dots. So I'm just zooming in on one of them here. So this entry is for Apolinar Rosales Mendez. They say he was 33 when he died. The cause of death they list is probable hypothermia. This is Alvaro Enciso. He's an artist. He lives in Tucson, about an hour's drive from the border. And every Tuesday since 2013, he drives into the wilderness, following the GPS coordinates of that map, that website, to the site of where somebody breathed their last breath. So the GPS. So there in that exact location, Alvaro is adamant that he has to find the exact location. He plants a cross, and he makes these crosses in his home studio, his artist studio at his house. And each cross that he makes is a work of art of found objects, so objects that he finds there in the desert near other sites of death. He uses what people leave behind, so what people have dropped while they're on the run, trying to survive the crossing. Photos from a wallet is what he finds. Metal from cans, canvas from backpacks, glass from bottles, rubber from a shoe, and he repurposes all of that for his crosses. Alvaro told me that each of those objects remembers part of somebody's story. So they're artifacts from a life that we will never know. And he includes these fragments as a form of acknowledgement, of reverence, to honor these people, to use material from their lives as relics on a cross. Each crucifix remembers a life lost to those immigration policies. So, I mean, he takes this, you can see it's an installation piece for him. He talks about, he works in the biggest gallery that he's ever been able to present his art, which is the Sonoran Desert. And he makes this art for potentially other people who might be crossing, or only for God alone. So this installation project is called Donde Mueren los Sueños, Where Dreams Die. His crosses mark the places where those dreams, people's dreams of a new life, where those dreams have expired, with landscape haunted with hope's expired breath. Alvaro told me that he's installed over 1,000 crosses there in the borderlands. He says at the rate he's working through the database, and he says that with the rate he's going, he'll finish his work when he's 127. That's about the time that to make a cross for each person who's died. But then he also adds that doesn't take into account the people who die every month and are recorded. Not far from these sites where Alvaro works and puts out his crosses, there's this town called Eloy. And in this town, there's a private prison. It's kind of a regional detention center for undocumented immigrants. Over a century ago, according to the local legend there in Eloy, there's a train. And the train stopped at the desert outpost between Tucson and Yuma. So Tucson's kind of in the middle of the state. Yuma is on the border with California. And a conductor new to that train route, at the stop, he looked out at the desolate landscape and recited the words of the crucified Jesus. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? So, in my Bible, it's E-L-O-I, and then apparently E-L-O-Y, they changed it. Or maybe that's what in their Bibles, I don't know. That's the legend. So after that, the story goes, that spot became known as the town of Eloy. And when I heard that legend, I thought of it as a kind of horrific prophecy. The train's conductor foretelling like this other Golgotha, the site of crucified lives, people incarcerated. I've been out to this prison a few times, and I joined the visitation group. It's called Casa Mariposa Visitation Program. It's an immigrant justice community there in Tucson. Inside the Eloy facility, one time I met this person. When I go, you meet person after person, and they share you their stories. They're very glad to meet with you. there's someone from the outside. It's a gift for them. And they ask us to tell their stories to people on the outside. So that's why I'm telling you about their stories. And I'll tell you about one story that I remember. It's kind of lodged in my mind about a man I met there. When the guard called out this man's name, he leapt. I could see him leap to attention, and he walked over to the booth where I was seated. There's 2 chairs, one for him, one for me. And before he got there, he just came over and shook my hand, just so warm, glad to talk with me. And he asked all about me, where I was from. Usually people just kind of tell you their story, but he was just very interested in where I was from, and about my family, hobbies, what I did for work. And I mentioned that I was born and I grew up in California, and he kind of just became alive. And he's like, yeah, that's where I grew up too, in Fresno. And so we talked about our home state for a while. He said he was born elsewhere, but his parents brought him to California as a child, so it's kind of the only place that he ever knew as home. He said he'd been locked up for 3 years at that point when I saw him. And he was being moved from prison to prison. He does months here. That's unusual to be 3 years in a detention facility, immigration detention facility. But he says, he's months here and then there, and they move him because he gets in trouble. He said, so they transfer him. And he says the reason why he gets in trouble is because he has multiple mental health diagnoses, and no one ever pays attention to his charts and the meds he needs. And so he suffers from some kind of episode and loses control. So I asked him, in the midst of all this, how he gets through the days, weeks, months, years at this point. And he grinned and he told me about how he and his friends on the inside, they always make up like special things to look forward to give make some kind of meaning out of the madness. And I was just visiting him right after Christmas. And so he told me about the very special thing that they just did, he and his friends, which is that they make Christmas tamales. So for months they save up money that their people from the outside send them, and then they blow it all on stuff to make tamales prison style. And what prison style means, with the limited options available to them as ingredients. So they buy packs of Doritos, he said, from the commissary, which they mush into like a chunky powder, Dorito chips, and they use that as flour. And then in the bowl, they add water to the pulverized chips, and that's the masa. Is there an English translation for masa? Masa is just masa. I think it's just masa. It's just masa. And then for the filling for the masa, he says that from the commissary again, they buy what's called, very overpriced, what's called pork product. This is what it says on the label. And then they have to douse it with tapatio to just add some kind of flavor. So then after this careful assembly of the Dorito, masa, and the tapatio infused pork product, they take a couple of plastic trash bags and they cut them into large rectangles because that's the only thing they could come up with for the husks, like the corn husks that you put around a tamale. And so they fold up each tamal into a strip of plastic, and then they put it in the microwave for 6 minutes. So I asked him how much they spent to make these tamales. And I could see him kind of calculating the math in his head. $80 for 12 tamales, but worth every dollar, he said. Because in prison, where guards administer misery to crush their spirits, that Christmas meal tastes like a fleeting moment of freedom. To survive on friendship and $80 tamales. La Casa del Migrante is part of the missionaries of St. Charles Scalabrini. It's a Roman Catholic religious order founded in 1887 to minister to migrants. This is their shelter in Tijuana, Mexico. It was established in 1987. Globally, the Scalabrini International Migration Network administers over 250 local ministries in 33 countries. So this is serving people on the move all over the world. These individuals and families who've had to flee from violence, from political oppression, from wrecked economies, from devastation of the climate crisis. When I was there on my first day at La Casa, I met Miguel. He's the community chef. And he taught me the art, very important art, the art of making arroz y frijoles, beans and rice, for 100 people. And so he taught me how he gently scatters these chunks of red onion into this massive shimmering pot of oil. He's cutting onions there. And then he gave me this big wooden spoon to stir the onions as they blistered. And then as I was doing that, he dumped a bucket of rice into the pot, and the grains crackled in the oil. And he explained to me that the rice needed to brown without sticking to the bottom. And so he showed me this rhythm of how to stir the rice, to push and pull the rice so that it wouldn't burn. And when he showed me how to do it, it looked like a dance. It was very elegant. I'm like, wow, this is impressive. And then he gave me this big spoon, which is like the size of an oar. And I did it, and I was clanging stuff, tripping over myself. But he was very patient, gracious man. And then Miguel, at some point, as I was trying to work the rice, he came over and poured a bucket of caldo. It's the leftover water from the chicken that he had boiled the day before that he had in the refrigerator. And then the rice kind of just simmered in all of that. Then he had another bucket, this one filled with tomatoes and onions and garlic. And then he did this thing where it was all there, it was all boiling. And then he got some salt, took some salt, and he sprinkled it into the pot of rice, and he sprinkled it in the form of a cross, so just like one down to the middle and then another to the side. I don't know if he was making a cross, but that's just maybe the way he decided to distribute it. But for me, I saw it as a cross, a kind of blessing over this meal. And I just was overcome with silence, and I felt like I should cross. I'm not Catholic, but I almost felt like I should cross myself. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, because this meal was a blessing for so many people. The food preparation was holy work. Later in the day, sometime in the afternoon, as I went up to rest just for a few minutes before the evening rush in the kitchen, but I heard this joyful sound down in the dining area, so I decided to go check out what was going on, and I saw Ani, who is a longtime volunteer from Costa Rica, and she was serving up bowls of Jamaica with tajin as a pre-dinner snack. So I joined her in the kitchen to help out, and I quickly found that I was unneeded. Everything was going great, and I was just meeting the new arrivals who had just come into the shelter, and they were from El Salvador, and they were making Salvadoran guacamole, which has hard-boiled eggs in it, which I had never tasted before. I grew up with Mexican guacamole, which doesn't have hard-boiled eggs. Anyway, it was really good. And so as they were making guacamole, a woman from Sinaloa, Mexico, was rolling out masa for tortillas, making tortillas, and she was passing it to her son, who was frying them on the large stove there. And we just feasted, eating tortillas and guacamole. And as we did so, this woman from Sinaloa who was making the tortillas, she told me that her family had just fled from their home after the cartel tried to recruit her 16-year-old son. She said that she and her husband and her son were now on their way to Fresno to her sister if they're able to cross. I mean, the choice is, do you let the cartel jump your son into their gang, or you leave? It seems like not even a choice. Obviously, you leave. At La Casa, every meal, like I said, was holy. These are like the domestic arts of the kitchen became sacred rites of communion. These food and stories passed from person to person, conversations about who had just crossed the day before and wondering who might cross tomorrow. Every meal felt like a kind of Last Supper. There's a theme in the Bible of strangers, of foreigners, turning out to be God. A theme that goes back to Abraham and Sarah in Genesis, when they invited 3 travelers to rest in their tent. They washed their feet, gave them bread and water. This is an icon. I imagine everyone has, hopefully you've all seen this icon by now. This is an icon of that scene in Genesis from chapter 18. The artist is Andrei Rublev from the 15th century. The icon is known it has 2 names, this icon. Some people call it the Trinity, so you have a depiction there of the persons of the Trinity. It's also called the Hospitality of Abraham. The 3 visitors are depicted as members of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Rublev took his cue from that biblical text from Genesis 18, where the 3 strangers, the travelers, are called the Lord. Here's the passage. I've seen this image for a long time, and only recently what's become more and more fascinating to me is the tree in the background. Everyone talks about this foreground here, especially with the communion meal there in the middle, and it's being offered by the triune persons for anyone. And it's inviting us. You look at the icon, you travel in to communion. But it's just so interesting to think about that tree as also bearing witness. It's something that came to my mind in the midst of our climate crisis too, to think about how nature shows up in iconography. Anyhow, Genesis 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the Lord. So it's just been so much commentary. Professor Marzouk, you could probably explain this much better than I can, but it's always been this topic of conversation among the rabbis, among biblical commentators. You have the Lord in the singular, and then all of a sudden the Lord is 3 persons. It's just this interesting grammatical situation here. So the Lord in the form of 3 persons. Rublev read these 3 strangers as the presence of the triune God. That's what his icon does. The book of Hebrews picks up on this story and turns it into a command. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained messengers, angels, without knowing it. So I think it's also important to note that this is a command here, but it's rooted in a story. It draws us back to the long, sweeping story of the biblical narrative. It's not just hey, you should do this because, well, you should do this. It's like, remember. The Greek word for hospitality to strangers here is philoxenia. And philo means love. Xenos means foreigner, stranger, alien. I know etymology doesn't mean meaning, but it's interesting to note that those 2 words are in that word. Because that's the nature of hospitality. It's to welcome aliens, to extend care for strangers, to love foreigners. It's also interesting to note the chapter in Hebrews 13 opens with it says, do not, or what does it say? Let mutual affection abide among you. And that language for mutual, or brotherly love is some translations. And that word there is Philadelphia, where we get the word Philadelphia. But you see the same Philadelphia being brother, so you have that same word. And then right after it says, it's like, wait a minute. Don't forget this other kind of care, this love for strangers, aliens. So the 2 go together for Hebrews, the book of Hebrews. At the end of Luke's gospel, we read the story. I'm just kind of rushing through stories to get our imagination going and to convince you that maybe you don't need convincing. This is care for immigrants is like the Bible story as well. At the end of Luke's gospel, we read about Jesus and the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. I love this story so much. So, this is after Jesus is resurrected from the dead. He's appeared to the women at the empty tomb. The rest of the disciples are totally bewildered, including these 2 people who are on their road to Emmaus. Just because of time, I'm not going to read the whole passage here. Hopefully you all have it memorized by now. These 2 disciples are going from Jerusalem to Emmaus, which is about 7 miles outside of Jerusalem. And they're talking to each other about what happened while they're talking and discussing, Jesus himself comes near and kind of walks with them. But it says that their eyes were refrained. They couldn't recognize him. Their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And so Jesus, who's incognito at this point, he says to them, what are you discussing while you are walking along? And they kind of stood still, looking sad. And then one of them, whose name is Cleopas, answered Jesus and said, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days? Everyone's talking about this. How do you not know? So they don't recognize him, Cleopas and the other disciple. He doesn't look like what Jesus is supposed to look like. Maybe he doesn't sound right. Maybe his appearance is a little strange. Maybe his words sound odd. Maybe he looks like a foreigner. Are you the only foreigner, stranger in Jerusalem? The word in Greek here for Jesus is parokeo. It's a word for pilgrim, sojourner, someone who lives outside or adjacent of the household, of the people, an alien. The definition that I just looked up in my Greek English lexicon, Bauer and Denker, if anyone's taken Greek these days. The definition there for the word is the state of being in a strange locality without citizenship, to sojourn, to stay in a foreign country. That's what that word means. So to be without citizenship in a foreign land. That's the kind of person that Jesus looks like to these disciples on the road to Emmaus. So they call him a parocheo, a foreigner without citizenship. It's important to look at where the word shows up elsewhere in the Bible. It's also nice that it shows up in Acts. So in Luke Acts, you have the same word coming. And this is from Stephen. When Stephen's testimony before the council, he's recounting the whole story of God's people. And here, I won't read it all, but just highlight a few things. He uses a related word, parocheos, to describe Abraham and Moses. So Abraham, who followed God's call, left his homeland, and he and his descendants, it says there in verse 6, would become resident aliens in a country. That's how it translates that same word. In a country belonging to others. So Abraham as a resident alien. Then again later, it's a long speech, if you remember in Acts. Towards the end of it, he talks about Moses, who fled Midian, also as a parokos. When Moses heard this, he fled Midian, where he settled as a foreigner, a resident alien. It's interesting that in Acts, the NRSV translates it as resident alien and then goes for stranger in Luke when it talks about Jesus. Anyhow, so a foreigner, a resident alien, that's the category of the person of who the disciples see on the road to Emmaus when this stranger strikes up this conversation with them, someone who doesn't have citizenship documents. Here's the passage again. Cleopas says to Jesus, who he doesn't recognize, "Are you the only stranger, the only foreigner in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have taken place?" The more I read the story, I mean, you don't get tone of voice in the passage, but when you read it, you have to provide a tone of voice. And when I read it, I think more and more that Cleopas sounds like a little annoyed to me. He's having this private conversation with his friend. It's this traumatic moment. It's private, and he's kind of annoyed with the way that this foreigner interrupts his walk with his friend. Are you the only stranger, foreigner in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's taken place? Sounds kind of annoyed with the way that this foreigner barges into a conversation where he does not belong. So Cleopas thinks that this foreigner on the road is ignorant, no idea what's going on, and he's kind of a nuisance. When I read this story, it sounds more and more like Jesus is an intrusion. He's inconvenient. He's uninvited. But he becomes a fellow traveler, if you continue to read the story in Luke 24. He's a conversation partner. He inserts himself into the conversation. He becomes a pilgrim with them, with the disciples. I think one important thing that we can learn here from Jesus, one thing that Jesus reveals to us about God, is that we never know when God might show up. To pay attention to a stranger, to a foreigner, is to learn how to pay attention to God. That's what happens in the story about Emmaus. When later, as we keep on reading, the two disciples welcome this foreigner into their home, and when they welcome him at their table, they eat together. The story ends, as you know, with the disciples offering hospitality to Jesus. This Jesus who they think is just another foreigner in the city. If you remember how the story goes, when they sit down for a meal, Jesus blesses the bread and passes the food around the table. And in that moment of sharing a meal, the disciples finally recognize him to be Jesus. I also think it's just wild to imagine Jesus as, this stranger foreigner being invited into these people's homes, and they're like sit around the table, and if you know how what it's like to be a good guest, is typically you don't go like going through someone's pantry, but there's Jesus, he's just like, okay, we're sitting here, and he grabs their bread and offers it to them for a meal. Jesus is the worst kind of guest, which should teach us something about what it means to welcome guests. So just to close here, the Christian life, I think, is about learning together in our communities to make room for God's kingdom, his kingdom of hospitality, to make room for the very life of Christ in our midst, this one who comes to us in the lives of our neighbors and strangers and foreigners, to welcome each other, to eat around tables, and await the presence of God. That's what it means to be a Christian. And the good news is this, that despite it all, despite this horrible world we've made, despite the terror of neighbors being disappeared all around us, there are celebrations. There are people who provide for each other, make meals in migrant shelters. There are prisoners who make tamales to sustain their spirits. And there are people who look out for each other, strangers who do what they can with what they have, making room for the possibility of another world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Isaac.
I think it's on.
Yeah. No. Is that on? No.
Maybe you can come up here. And this one back here.
Because I just wanted to pass it around. So, thank you, Isaac, for your presentation. I loved intertwining together both story and scripture. So, love that. There is a chance for us to have questions. If you have any question, I don't know if this is working, but I will pass it unless you speak loudly. And because this mic is not connected to the live streaming, I will remind Isaac to paraphrase.
Oh, that mic is correct.
This
Connected.
is? Oh, okay.
That's great. Perfect.
So I am live streamed. So any questions?
Questions are like inspiration, I'm very interested in how stories sustain our hope and our imagination. So maybe you had a spark of imagination.
Hi, Isaac. Thank you so much for your talk, and it's nice to see you. I haven't seen you since we were in Durham like 20 years ago, so this is fun. I wondered if you could say a little bit, because you're talking about stories and the ways they inspire hope, but I noticed that where you ended was actually food. So can you just maybe elaborate a little bit more for me on the embodied piece here of the relationship between telling stories and actually feeding, even when there isn't a lot of food? Because I'm hearing that piece, so if you just share a bit more.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, food. So I've been talking about this book I wrote and doing interviews about it, and a few interviewers have pointed out that food is like a subplot of the book. I talk about food there at the migrant shelter, food in prison, talk about my grandmother's kitchen, and I think part of it, at least from where my culture, where I come from, there is very much this sense of we get to know each other around tables and around eating. That has always been significant of my formation of what it means to be a people, to be a family, and how the borders of family always get blurred. I love this phrase from the theologian Asasi Diaz, who talks about the kingdom of God and how we form ourselves into this kingdom through sharing meals. That's what she's talking about, how the family network is not necessarily biological kin, but extends itself. We make our kin. We become kin to one another. And yeah, I've grown up with that happening, the physical place where that happens the most is around meals. And my grandmother making arroz con pollo and like inviting all the cousins and like my friends who become cousins to eat there. So I think that's part of it is why food is so, why I give attention to food. Maybe to be more like Christian about it, biblical about it, to be like, yeah, it's an important part of the biblical story as well. I mean, the Bible opens with like what food you're supposed to eat and not eat, and getting kicked out of a garden because you're eating the wrong food. And you have, all the way through Scripture, this emphasis on food. That icon from Rublev, the way he's getting at the fact that like this is a Bible story of people finding each other around the table, around hospitality. Anyhow, so I think that the food, and like, I don't know, it's hard to be sad when you're eating. I mean, right? Like, I feel like there's something to food being comforting. I mean, we talk about like comfort food. And as I think about what it means to sustain my own faith and community and groups, and this is in activist communities as well, like if someone brings food, like the conversation goes better. Sometimes alcohol, some wine makes the conversation go better too. So the sense of like that we're embodied people and food does something for our imagination, I think is really important. So anyhow, that's I'm making myself hungry here. So
there is dinner after the.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
I can still hear you. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's fine.
Thank you so much. I came from South Korea, and I'm always feeling a liminal being here. So if the Lord, if the God identifies with the stranger, so how should we reshape the way we think about our own identity as migrants or aliens?
Yeah, this is great. Yeah, so it's a really important question about how, basically what I presented here is how to deal with strangers as if they're other than us. But what do you do if you're the stranger, you're the foreigner, and what does that mean for your life in this community, right? That's such an important I mean, it is a very important point. I don't know what else to say other than, I think you should, we need to tell these stories about what it means. One place to go to, I mean, because Luke 24 is on my mind, and the story of Emmaus is, I think it's just really interesting the way that part of what happens with the two disciples when they're not able to see the stranger Jesus to be Jesus is that they're not attending to themselves. And the reason why I say that is because it's only afterwards, after Jesus appears around, serves them food, and their eyes are opened, and then you have one of John Wesley's favorite lines, the Methodist favorite line is, Jesus disappears, and the two disciples are like, "Were not our hearts strangely warmed?" While they were talking with Jesus along the way. So it is the case that the two disciples, there was something going on in them that they weren't able to recognize, something strange. They were not able to see their own strangeness in this situation, is what I'm saying. So I think part of what your question is highlighting to me is that we need to learn to provide some kind of attention, some kind of acknowledgement of the way that we're all kind of estranged. And there's important notes going on within us that we're not attended to because we're so caught up in whatever else might be going on. So that the stranger is always us as well, I think is an important thing to recognize. And Derrida and Levinas would be helpful in thinking through about what this means of recognizing the other as also part of us.
I have a question. So you started with talking about the sanctuary movement, and maybe not everyone is familiar with what the sanctuary movement is, and whether it is in any city, or is it still alive? There is a tag on it. Can people start it somewhere? Because I looked up Richmond, for example, and there is no. There is, or in Virginia. So would you shed some light on that,
right.
please?
Yeah, so sanctuary movement is basically that churches, or it could be other faiths too, religious institutions, that you consider that space as holy, as sacred, and that no one should trespass into it to violate that sanctified space. And so religious communities would say, look, we're going to protect this person from law enforcement with our own lives through civil disobedience, and say you can't take this person from our property. This tradition, at least here in the United States, like there's the modern sanctuary movement, but it reaches back to the 1980s, where along the border, but then it grew throughout the United States, people would welcome refugees, asylum seekers from the Central American wars that Reagan was helping to fund. President Reagan was helping to fund. So Reagan was funding, what he took to be anti-communist regimes, which became dictatorships, and people were fleeing for their lives. But Reagan would not acknowledge these people, would not acknowledge the US's involvement in funding those regimes, because that looks really bad. And so he did not talk about these people as people seeking asylum or fleeing from war or war refugees. He instead called them economic migrants, which is a phrase that has been around since then. So no, they're just looking for a better life. Well, churches along the border there in Tucson, Arizona, Southside Presbyterian was one of the first churches that did this. They said, well, our government is denying these people, we will welcome them. And so they welcomed them onto church property. And they had press conferences and said, hey, look, we're doing this. This is what it means to be faithful people of God. FBI, Border Patrol, you're not allowed to come onto church property. And it was successful, and it became a version of the Underground Railroad, is what they called it, in terms talking about linking their own work of sanctuary to freedom from slavery. This tradition of people providing, like Harriet Tubman and folks providing this Underground Railroad to take enslaved people to the north. But it goes all the way back to the Bible with cities of refuge, about how there were these communities where in Israel, where people would go to have time to process perhaps a crime they committed, or to let all the hotheads chill for a while. And they were known as sanctuary cities of refuge. So there's this biblical tradition. And we could go into church history as well. So there's this long history of the sanctuary movement. So right now, we met right when the second time Trump was elected into office. So in December, those of us who were doing sanctuary work in North Carolina met together and trying to figure out whether or not we should do it again and how to organize. And there was this sense among us, these are all pastors of churches that had someone in sanctuary during the first Trump administration, that publicizing people in sanctuary would put a target on their back, because there was this sense that the new Trump administration would be even more vicious. Before, in the first Trump administration, there was this, I don't know how important all the details are. Basically, there was an agreement that ICE agents would not trespass onto sensitive locations, which included religious communities, as well as hospitals, courts, schools, and all of that is, no longer the case. So I would say that public sanctuary, it's not happening very often. I don't hear that much about it, but there are communities that are doing non-public sanctuary. And some of the same communities that were churches who were organizing in the first Trump administration are just not talking about it. So it's hard to find them. We have two more questions over here. I don't know if we have time.
We'll see. I don't think so. I want to thank you, first of all, especially for underlining that Greek word in Luke 24. I will never read that story the same way again, and I thank you for that. I'm wondering, since sanctuary is not what you're attempting these days, not in the same way, what kind of activism are you engaged in, and what are you thinking is more effective at this point in our lives together?
Yeah,
I'm also I was amazed by that story, the second sanctuary story. Was it Samuel?
Samuel.
Not getting the pronunciation quite right, but you all were clearly prepared to act in a way that was courageous and organized, and so I'm curious about that preparation as well.
Let's see. Let me start with the first. Yeah, I'll just take it as you. So the first question is about, if sanctuary is not happening now, what are other forms of organizing? And so what's happening right now? I mostly know my community in North Carolina, but then through that there's like a lot of sharing across communities throughout the United States. So I know other places are doing it. I don't know what's going on here in Richmond. But to organize in terms of community defense and ICE watchers. So to recognize that ICE always operates like on the edge of the law. It's not exactly lawful what they're doing. And so they don't necessarily like it when they are recorded of what they're up to. So communities have organized, these are communities of people who are using their white privileges as citizens who are going out and tracking down where ICE is showing up in a neighborhood, at a Home Depot, and bringing out their phones and just documenting, and they're just being a nuisance. Say like, hey, look, why are you here? Are you an agent? Who do you work for? What's your badge number? So those sorts of questions are a major distraction from ICE operations because they don't want to be so that's one thing that's going on, ICE Watch. But recognize that things are a lot more. We were doing this during the first Trump administration, and it was working well. This Trump administration, you could potentially be arrested, so it's very dangerous, but that's what communities are doing, ICE watching, community defense. In terms of the sanctuary work that we did during the first Trump administration, we were very well organized, but we were also we were discovering we did not know a lot as we were working things out. So my friend, she's a pastor in Greensboro, Julie Peoples, and her church was one of the first to have someone in sanctuary in North Carolina. And I remember on a call we were talking about sharing wisdom, insight, how this is going, and she was like, we're just building this plane as we're flying it, which was how it was. So for example, we were good with Rosa training people in civil defense, de-escalation training, how to talk to an officer and try to take the temperature down, all of those sorts of things. We arranged for grocery runs, and as a pastor, basically a pastor, at least my experience of being a pastor, was preaching and Excel spreadsheets, because I was always you always got to plan worship and all that kind of. Anyhow, so I just had Excel spreadsheets on rotations of people to get her groceries. But then she texted me, this was the first or second week she was living at church, and she's like, Pastor, what, I'm que vergüenza, how embarrassing. But how do I do my laundry? And I was just like, oh my gosh, how are we gonna do we thought about converting an office into her room. We had converted a janitor's closet that had water hookups and drainage hookups into a bathroom, a contractor from church remodeled the whole closet into a nice bathroom. But I just had not thought about laundry. And so I had to come up with another spreadsheet. So it was yes, organizational foresight, but also you just don't know sometimes what you're getting yourself into. But what organized our lives was a commitment to her, where we said, we are gonna keep you safe here for as long as you wanna be here. We will reorganize, reshuffle our lives and make this happen. You just let us know what we need to do. And that commitment made possible the creativity of figuring out what to do later on. Oh yeah, you got a question? No?
Probably the same question. On that point, there is actually a group here in Richmond called Richmond Defensa, and I have to connect you with them. They do actually training on how to disrupt ICE prisons. So far, they do training in preparation. So when they show up, they have not done something on the ground. They are preparing. I'm happy to continue. Maybe one last question. Yeah. Here. Well, this is fine.
Yeah, for the live stream.
It
For the
also
live
feels
stream.
good to
Yeah,
hold the mic
that's
while
good.
you're asking the
So
question.
it's for the live stream. It's good. Yeah.
Okay, this is not a particularly, maybe a fun one to end on, but in this past week, I have been in such the thought of how am I reading the same book as so many other Christians in this nation and coming to such radically different conclusions. And so I wonder to hear your thoughts on kind of the right way or the right way to be a migrant in our country. Because I think it's
Wait, say that
interesting,
again? The right way to what?
the right way to be a migrant or who is a good migrant in our country. I think, we heard an example a little bit from our Polish friends, the disparity of Ukrainian refugees versus other refugees in Europe. We've seen that disparity here as well. But what's interesting is that you can look at other examples in the Bible as well of that we uplift of the foreigner, of like Ruth and Rahab, or even Abraham, and a lot of the patriarchs in the Genesis story of they were foreigners themselves, but they were good foreigners, right? Like they kind of integrated or they did things for the Jewish people. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of this response of, well, but there's a right way to do it, and this kind of rule of law kind of question of how would you respond to someone who might hear these stories and say, that's great, that's heartbreaking, but they need to do it the right way. There's a right way to be a migrant in our country.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, is there a right way to be a migrant in our country, and kind of biblical precedents? Well, what I've been saying when I'm involved in some of these conversations where people don't like what I'm saying about hospitality and migrants, and I'm in those conversations, I get invited to talk to all sorts of people. The first thing I say is that we need to begin to read the Bible and recognize that the subplot of the Bible is migration. So it might not be the plot, but it is a subplot. So from beginning to end, so there in Genesis, the first story is a forced migration. You have people, Adam and Eve, forced by God out of their homeland to go elsewhere, to like make a life east of Eden that is going to be very hard. And then you can blah, 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 blah. But the beginning and the ending of a story are super important. And so the end of the story, in the book of Revelation, it ends with a migration where you have, and I know the speaker tomorrow, she's the expert on this stuff, but so I'll probably make a mistake here after you listen. But it's this migration of the heavenly city to earth. So in Revelation 21, you have God's city, the heavenly city, the New Jerusalem, descends to earth. And so it is a migration story. And when it descends to the earth, one of the most fascinating part of that story for me is that the author, John the Seer, let's say, goes to great length to talk about how massive these walls are for the city. So many cubits, it's made of this precious metal, these diamonds or whatever, jewels. It's just very impressive. You walk away. And then he's like, and there's 12 gates, I think it is. And then he's just like, and the gates will never be closed. And you're just like, wait a minute. What's the point of all the walls? You got these gates that are never closed. And it says, so that, and there will always be day in the city, so that the nations can stream in and bring their gifts. And so it's just this is the story. It's a subplot from beginning to end. So I talk about that, hey, look, the Bible is about this. And in terms of good migrant, bad migrant story, hopefully with what I was saying about Luke 24 there with Jesus, is I think he's he's a bad foreigner. He's a bad visitor. He's a bad guest. If someone came to my house and I was like, hey, look, I'm gonna let's get together, and then they're all of a sudden going through my refrigerator and feeding me. That's weird. That's not what you do. So it's Jesus is this kind of bad foreigner. But there's all kinds of stories. So Rahab, did you mention Rahab? I can't remember. But yeah, Rahab. Like, okay, Rahab, Jericho, what does she do? She like betrays her people, which leads to the downfall of her people, the city, right? And she lies to lies to the king. So if you remember, so Rahab is there, Joshua and like maybe one or two other people, they scale the walls of Jericho, and for whatever, because, the Bible likes to like mess things up in terms of our formation of what we think is right or wrong. They find hospitality with a sex worker, like she's the virtuous person who extends hospitality to these folks. And she hears that the king and his men are coming because they heard about these foreigners who've breached the walls. And she's like, hey, look, go hide up in my roof. There's like the spot, like you can be safe there. And the king comes and he asks her, like, we heard that you have these visitors. Where are they? And she's like, no, I don't. Like, what in the world? And so then, she betrays her people and for the sake of God's people. Like, I don't know how you read that as good news to the state. You know what I mean? Like, that is just... Anyhow, but the thing that I'll end on in terms of what I have found most helpful in terms of talking to other people who are Christians, who are struggling with understanding how to make sense of immigrants and who have a conception of the good immigrant, which is it's impossible, like nearly impossible to get documentation status at this point. The good immigrant and the bad immigrant. I pray with them the Lord's Prayer. In the Lord's Prayer, and I say, like, let's talk about this. And in the Lord's Prayer, we say, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. That's one version. That's the version I know. And let's think about trespasses. What does it mean to be a Christian where we pray? Like, this is like a foundational prayer for the church. We pray it in my church every time we gather for communion. And we pray, forgive us our trespasses, recognizing that we're always trespassing, and forgive those who trespass against us. Like, those are my, you know what I mean? Like, these are people who are trespassing, and we hold it against them. That is not the Lord's Prayer. That is a way of life that is opposite of that prayer. So I'm like, either pray the prayer and mean it, or just don't pray it if you don't mean it. That's what I've been saying. Thank you all. Thanks.
I think dinner will be served in Holderness Hall at 6:15. If you don't know where that is, for the crowd. Thank you all, and we'll see you tomorrow. Turn that off.
Yeah, just
If they didn't. Hey, thank you so much.
was that okay?
Yeah.
That was good. Okay,
Absolutely.
good. Yeah, I enjoyed.
Yeah, I will.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
That's your what?
That'd be great. I'll make my way out.
Well, I'm sad about eating certain things.